So what I would like to discuss here today is we most of the above consultants here today with us are I'm just guessing they are into SAP Fiori also because for all these latest SAP releases, the application front end is SAP Fiori. So I'm practicing SAP Fiori since SAP released the first wave of applications with the 25 initial applications. So it's been a long time I'm working with Fiori applications. So whenever we deploy a Fiori application or a Fiori landscape to a customer, that I mean, many of for the many of the customers, that was the first application or web portal, enterprise web portal, which is exposed to the internet. So they always had to take approvals from their higher management, and their security team, etc., for this internet facing of Fiori application. Because essentially, what they're doing, they are exposing their ERP system to the internet, right? So it is essential that to ensure that the application is having enough security, non-hackable application, so to expose it. Especially this happens in Middle East, and they are so concerned about the security of the solution we are developing and facing to internet. So when we talk about the landscape security, what all the measures which we can propose to the customer to have in the landscape before exposing these Fiori applications to the internet. So definitely we will be starting with the HTTPS, because no one in this year exposing application with an HTTP. All the browsers will show a security alert if you don't have HTTPS, or if you're having an invalid HTTPS SSL certificate. So what HTTPS or a valid SSL certificate gives when we are exposing it to the internet is that the data which is sent from the browser to the server is nothing but our SAP landscape, will be end-to-end encrypted, which means all the data you are sending through the URL or through the HTTP post body will be encrypted, so that an intruder in between cannot simply take the data what you are sending. It will be encrypted. But there are cases that even if you're having an SSL certificate, the data can be extracted if if the hacker is good enough. So HTTPS alone is not not an enough security for any web landscape. Now another thing which we can do in a landscape is SNC, which is called network communication between the systems. As we all know that the SAP NetWeaver gateway, our Fiori system, Fiori landscape, is connecting to the corresponding backends, be it S4H, ECC, or any system, is through trusted RFC, remote function calls, trusted RFC connections. So when we're establishing this trusted RFC connection, we use secure network communication protocol between two SAP systems, so that the data which is sent from NetWeaver gateway to the backend and the data which is sent by the backend to the NetWeaver gateway will be encrypted, and that will be secured. Now, the common practice I have seen in many customer sites that the basis consultant over there just right-click the UI5 underscore UI5 tag in the ICF and activate everything underneath. Instead of going for one by one UI5 applications, we just activate everything at once, so that in the future we won't be facing any issue of, okay, this ICF was deactivated, hence the user is not able to access the solution. So I have seen this in many cases. We should mandatorily avoid such a thing of activating a base node. We should always activate the UEFI application and the OData node, which we are actively using in the production landscape. It's definitely okay for a development system or even in a QA system to have everything activated. But the best practice is definitely to activate only what is necessary. Now, generally, people are not so happy with having just a login screen. Fiori is having definitely a login screen where we are feeding in the SAP username and password, right? The Fiori system username and password. So what's the additional level of authentication we can include in the system? So that's where multi-factor authentication is in place. So for multi-factor authentication, we can use many tools or solutions available in the industry, one of which is Microsoft ADFS. Active Directory Federal Services or Federation Services. I'm not sure about that. It's Active Directory Services. So if you enable ADFS solution, because I think most of the customers out there are using Outlook, right? So they have Microsoft Exchange. So definitely they are likely to have ADFS licenses as well. So if you link this ADFS system with our NetWeaver gateway, the login screen is not going to ask you for the SAP credential. Instead, it will be ask us to enter your AD, Active Directory ID, which you use to log into your Outlook. The same thing can be used for the corresponding login also. And if you enable multi-factor authentication, it is going to ask you, it's going to simply send you an OTP to your registered mobile number. And if you enter that OTP, then only you'll be able to access your Launchpad. I would say maybe 70% of the customers where I have implemented SAP Fiori have asked for ADFS with multi-factor authentication. So when we have Microsoft ADFS, the multi-factor authentication supports OTP sending, and it will even call your mobile number, and it just say to ask a button, say press 1 and press hash to continue. If you do that, then only it will let you log into the Fiori system. So additional level of authentication. Okay. Now comes the VPN. So when I say VPN, it's not definitely a solution to ask the end user to have a VPN installed in their system to access a productive service, right? So if someone asks me, okay, you have to have this VPN installed in your phone, so to access this application, no, it's definitely not going to help. So by VPN, what I meant is you can have a VPN tunnel established between your systems in your landscape. Suppose you have an ERP system and you are, say, in a military setup, so you don't want to expose your ERP system in any case. So instead of having a simple RFC connectivity between the NetWeaver gateway and the backend system, we can have a VPN tunnel, a secure VPN tunnel set up between your ERP system and your NetWeaver gateway system, so to ensure more security between these two. Which means, as and when this VPN is available and enabled, then only your gateway will be able to connect to the ERP system. This is generally helpful when your NetWeaver gateway system is in the cloud and you are having an ERP system in your on-premise, or if you are having a Launchpad in your SAP cloud platform where your ECC system is in your backend. In such cases, having a VPN setup is really helpful. Okay. There comes the next level of security using powerful reverse proxies. So SAP is having their own reverse proxy called SAP Web Dispatcher. That is an SAP product, which will be fronting your NetWeaver gateway. So we have an ECC system or S4HANA system. On top of that, we have a NetWeaver gateway system as a hub architecture. On top of that, you have a web dispatcher or any reverse proxy, which will be routing the incoming requests from the internet and sending response back to the client. So what all, even SAP is suggesting not to use SAP Web Dispatcher for productive purposes. SAP is suggesting to have other professional powerful reverse proxies for better security. So when SAP is saying something, which has something, right? So it's good to have reverse proxies like, say, Citrix or F5 or things like that, because I have seen people are using F5 like anything in many of the landscapes. So what all we can do there? So for one of the customers where I implemented this, the customer was asking us to share, as a Fiori consultant, we were asked to share the list of URLs which will be hitting the NetWeaver gateway system. So we had to open all the applications, everything, and take a list of even the OData calls, everything, to the F5, the reverse proxy security team. They had whitelisted all those patterns. For example, if you have a OData URL with a specific pattern, so we were asked to give that pattern to the security team so that they will whitelist that particular pattern. So if some intruder or someone who is getting the access and trying to exploit the data using, changing the URL and stuff, it's not going to work. It will just hit the reverse proxy and it will be rejected at that level itself. So it's like, imposing more security based on the URLs which a client is trying to access. Yeah, that was one of the good solutions I would prefer to have, especially when you are having too many applications exposed. So we will have a better control, right? Then the denial of service is something. Have you ever thought about, suppose you have an entity set which is taking say 1 minute or 30 seconds to get the data. What if someone called that URL in a loop, say 100 times? I'm just calling a URL 100 times in a loop from the front end. What basically happens? So definitely you are going to hit the backend system 100 times, right? So if the system is not strong enough, the system is going to come down. It's going to crash. So this kind of attack is called a denial of service, pinging the system endlessly from multiple systems. When we are doing it from multiple systems, it's called distributed denial of service attack. So how we will bypass this? In most of the powerful reverse proxies, there is a setup that if a client is sending more than 10 requests like that, I mean, a number of requests in a fixed time frame, it's going to reject the n plus 1 request just like that. So a user or a client cannot send frequent requests to the backend system. So it will be limited at the front end side itself. So this using usage of powerful proxies, enables this kind of initial level of security. Okay. Another flaw I have seen in many many landscape is that we have an authorization object called S underscore RFC ACL. So what does this authorization object does is it basically tells a system that which all are the system I am allowed to connect to, or which all are the URLs I am allowed to connect to. So when we are giving a star or a full authorization in S underscore RFC ACL, we basically telling the system that accept connection from everywhere. Simply, I have seen it even in production system for many customers that simply keeping or allowing all the access to everyone. So we should never allow that. We should always keep proper authorization values for S underscore RFC ACL. Like that, we have many other things, even for OData authorization. When you are defining an OData authorization, right? So we get this pop-up. So we have two options generally for OData, IWSG and IWSV. So suppose you have a leave application, and when you are creating a role for the leave application, make sure that you are creating one role for the front end and one role for the backend. And the front end role should have the tile, the group, and IWSG for the OData service which you are using. And for the backend, you should have IWSV for the OData service you are using. So what we are saying the system that the gateway user is authorized to use this OData service. And when it is reaching the backend, using S underscore RFC ACL, it says that, okay, this user can accept requests from this gateway system. And IWSV says that, okay, this user is allowed to access this OData service and consume it internally. So we should always give the minute level of, or the low level of authorization. So mostly we are following all these things, but I'm just, collating all this information we can generally follow. So this is a pair of roles I mentioned. One role is for the front end and one role is for the back end. And if you, okay, generally how we are assigning a tile to a user, we will have the application, BSP application or the UI5 application. We will create a tile and we will add this tile in the launchpad. So does that mean that the user can only access the application only through clicking the tile? Not always. If he is good enough, he can go to the network tab and do some tricks and open this application without the tile assigned to him. So how we can restrict it? We can definitely restrict it with this so that he will only see the user interface and not the OData calls. So one level of restriction can be done at this level. Another level of restriction can be done at this level also, which means you can have ICF node level authorization. So even if the user is trying to open the UI5 application through the ICF node, and if you don't have the authorization to access that specific ICF node, it will give 503 error to him. So he won't be able to consume that application completely. But I don't prefer to have this, not necessary, but sometimes it's good to have that minute level of authorization. and definitely followed by the tile and group. So I would say tile and group roles is the first level of abstraction which we can assign to a user. So if he's not seeing a tile, so he doesn't know, okay, what's actually behind that application, right? So that's the first level would be tile and group. Second level would be this, and third and last level would be this. Okay. Yeah, this is actually what I wanted to discuss a little further. As a developer, what all you must be following when we're developing an application. Okay, the first rule of any web application which we are exposed to outside is the validation rule. Whatever validation or whatever restrictions you are writing in a front end must be implemented in the backend also. For example, suppose you have a drop-down list in your application which displays a list of years to choose from, and it is having 2010 to 2020. Fine. And the user is supposed to choose an year out of this combo box. You choose it, you click on save so that you will send this year to the backend. Say someone inspect that particular combo box and add one more element like 2001. And if he clicks on create, this 2001 will go to the backend. If you are not handling the same validation or the restriction which you have written in the front end, in the backend also, it's going to create an entry with 2001, right? So having any validation, including data restriction, which you are doing in the front end, must be done in the backend also. This includes the mandatory checks. This includes a data type check. This includes, say, the date range. It includes anything, any type of restriction, any type of validation. This is one of the important rule everyone should follow when you are developing a web application. Okay. And we know that we always, or when we're using a web ID, it uglifies the whole UI5 project to one component preload, right? So we think that, okay, this is already uglified, this is already minified, this cannot be debugged in the front end. No, that concept is totally wrong. Uglifying is actually good because it gives less control to the intruder to make some corrections while debugging the application. But definitely it is debuggable. If you are good enough, you can, what to say, de-uglify the thing and debug it. As the file is downloaded and executed in the front end, you can do anything with the file. So always keep in mind that component preload JS file is debuggable. So uglifying is not enough in terms of front end security, but it is definitely good and we should do that. Okay. And another one is the handling the filters. Oh, there is a typo here. Handling the filters. So we all are aware about a kind of attack called SQL injection. So for a web developer, what's an SQL injection means is that suppose you have an OData service, right? And in an OData service, it's for an ABAP service. And from the front end, you are passing certain filters to limit the records which is propagated to the front end. Okay. And how we are handling the filters in the backend, we will receive the filters in IT_select options. Then we will query some database tables with the select options. If you are not handling a for all entries, an initial statement for this IT select option, or if you're directly passing these filters on the table, and if a user is removing these filters from the network tab of the call, it's going to fetch all the records. What if you're querying MSEC table, expecting that the call will always be coming with a filter? It's going to query the whole MSEC table, right? So it's this kind of manipulation is called SQL injection. Someone can change the queries so that it will be manipulated in the backend and fetch other information, other employee information, maybe. See, it's all depend on how you are writing a particular service. So be always conscious what you are writing. If it is not required, never write code in entity set, get entity set and all, unless it is highly necessary. So we should always be careful when you are writing your ABAP. Even that is applicable for your CDS exposure and even for your XSO data exposure also. XSO data is even risky to have because we generally expose a whole view there, right? So if you are not passing the proper filters, it's going to expose all the data to the front end. And this control is applicable even for denial of service also. If you are removing the filters, And if you are simply calling the service, it's going to fetch all the data. And fetching all the data is definitely painful for both application servers and for the database servers. If someone is calling this URL 1,000 times in a loop from 10 different systems, it's going to be 10,000 calls in a second, and that's going to bring down the system. Yeah, that's with SQL injection and filter handling. Yeah, the rule: never trust the target end users. They never underestimate the end users who is using this application. He can be vulnerable. He can inspect the application. He can make the changes. He can manipulate the data sent to the backend, etc. So it is, as a developer, it's our responsibility to ensure that our application is not hackable, not a penetratable application. So we should follow all these norms and make sure that application is good enough. No one can simply play with it. So for which, definitely one of the things which I have missed putting it in PowerPoint is, having proper authorization. An employee should have authorization to read his data only, right? So having all this proper authorization in the minute level will help when you are accessing confidential information. Yeah. Another thing I have seen in many places, in many programs, I have seen it even in SAP standard programs also, for non-read operations. When I say non-read operation, everything other than get, like delete, put, post, merge, all those stuffs are called non-read operations in an audited terminology. Some people simply call a get URL and handle it in the backend for a delete purpose or for a post purpose. Due to, they just do that. People just do this kind of evil things. Never do that. If you want to delete something, use a non-read operation. You can actually use a, say, post or put for delete. It's fine, but never use a read call for change operation. So avoid these kind of things, because as you see, the non-read operations are secured by the OData layer using CSRF tokens. So CSRF attack is kind of an attack which is happening from the front end side. So non-read operations are secured using CSRF tokens. Yep. So that is another set of it. Yeah. Important thing: never expose more than what is required in an OData service. Why? Because the metadata document of an OData service basically gives all the information about the things you are exposing to the internet. Suppose you have an access OData file, right? And you are exposing, say, 100 tables and 50 views in that. Someone who is opening that service is going to know that, okay, these many tables are exposed, these many views are exposed. I can query these tables and views and get the data I want, right? So always make sure that you are exposing what is necessary in a service. Okay, and that is actually applicable for any type of service, be it ABAP OData service, be it access OData service, be it anything, be it any API, that's actually applicable. Another point to ponder is exposing tables in access OData. This is actually a risky thing to do, because when we are projecting a table in access OData, by default, it will give you 4 interfaces. You can get the data, you can create new records, you can update the record, we can delete the record. By default, 4 options are in place. Now, if you expose this table only for a read purpose, best thing to do is write a view on top of that, then expose that view. Possibly create a calculation view with possible input parameters, then expose that calculation view with input parameter in the access OData, so that it is definitely going to be a read operation. And you can restrict the parameterized filters also. And if at all you are exposing tables for read purposes, you can forbid non-read operations. There is a statement like this: create forbidden, update forbidden, delete forbidden, like that. So if you do this, system will not let the front end to do any non-read operation. So this is an optional statement we can add. Okay. Another thing is anonymous connection in both access and ABAP ICF. What is an anonymous connection? When I say anonymous connection, if you hard code a credential in an ICF node in your ABAP system, that URL can be accessed without proper authentication from the front end, right? Because credentials are hard coded. So whoever is accessing that URL is a public URL. So be cautious when we are doing this. Unnecessarily don't hard code a credential and use it in an application. So if there is an option, always use URL with credentials and try to avoid anonymous connections. This rule applicable even in Access also, Access Engine also. In Access Engine, we can have anonymous database connections so that when the URL is accessed from the browser or from the internet or from the intranet, it's not going to ask for credential. It simply connects to the database using the anonymous connection user and gets the data. So be careful. Because it's again architect's discretion whether to use it or not. We can actually use it, but be careful with it. Yeah. SSO, single sign-on, is one of the important things to consider when we are designing your landscape. Suppose you have multiple systems connected in your Fiori launchpad. Say, for example, you have Fiori applications, you have, say, Tableau, you have, say, some SharePoint applications, you have K2 work list, you have multiple systems communicated from the front end itself. In that case, it's good to have an SSO enabled between these systems, even when you're consuming a third-party API. If the third-party API is not having authentication, or if it is having a token-based authentication, whatever it is, better to have an SSO between the NetWeaver Gateway production system and the API host, which is giving us the data, so that the authentication mechanism is always secured, and we are not simply exposing any endpoint without proper authentication. So that's all about the SSO thing. And that's all about the presentation today also.